Move, old lady, before I call security and have you dragged out of here like the piece of trash you are. Blake Morrison's platinum blonde hair caught the overhead lights as he loomed over Dorothy Washington, his voice dripping with the kind of venom that comes from a lifetime of believing other people exist solely for his convenience. The elderly black woman clutched her boarding pass with trembling fingers, her 74-year-old frame seeming impossibly small in the spacious first-class seat that her grandson had worked 3 jobs to afford, while every passenger within earshot felt their breath catch in their throats as they witnessed something that would change all their lives forever. Dorothy Washington had been awake since 4:30 a.m. Not because her aging body demanded it, but because her mind wouldn't stop racing with thoughts of her younger sister lying in a Los Angeles hospital bed fighting a battle against cancer that seemed to be slipping away with each labored breath. At 74, Dorothy had seen enough death during her 45-year nursing career to know when someone was preparing to let go, and the phone call from Patricia 3 days ago had carried that unmistakable tone of finality that made her pack her single suitcase with hands that shook more from emotion than age. She stood in her modest Detroit apartment, surrounded by the accumulated memories of a lifetime spent caring for others, her walls lined with thank you cards from grateful families, certificates of appreciation from hospitals where she'd worked double shifts during crises, and a single faded photograph from the 1963 March on Washington where a much younger Dorothy could be seen linking arms with strangers who shared her belief that dignity wasn't something you asked for, but something you claimed with quiet strength. The morning light filtering through her kitchen window illuminated the simple breakfast she'd prepared but couldn't bring herself to eat. Her stomach twisted with worry about Patricia and anticipation about flying for the first time in over a decade. When Terrell knocked on her door at 6 a.m., Dorothy felt her heart swell with the kind of love that transcends generations, the kind that makes a 17-year-old boy work at a grocery store for 4 months, bagging groceries and collecting shopping carts in the bitter Michigan winter, saving every dollar from his minimum wage paycheck so his grandmother could fly first class to say goodbye to the sister who had helped raise him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7. "Grandma Dorothy, you ready to fly like a queen?" he asked, his smile bright enough to chase away some of the sadness that had been hanging over their small family like a storm cloud, and when he pulled out the boarding passes printed on heavy cardstock that proclaimed her seat as 3A in the first-class cabin. Dorothy felt tears slide down her weathered cheeks, because no one in her family had ever experienced such luxury. "Baby, you didn't have to spend all that money on me," she whispered, running her fingers over the boarding pass like it was made of gold. But Terrell just wrapped his long arms around her shoulders and said, "Grandma, you spent your whole life taking care of everybody else, working nights and weekends, so I could have school clothes and birthday presents, never once complaining about how tired you were or how your feet hurt after standing for 12 hours straight. And now it's time for someone to take care of you, even if it's just for one flight to Los Angeles." The taxi ride to Detroit Metropolitan Airport passed in comfortable silence. Dorothy's hand clasped in Terrell's as she watched the city wake up around them, thinking about all the times she'd driven this same route to work, the early shift at various hospitals, never imagining she'd one day be traveling in luxury to say goodbye to Patricia, who had been more like a daughter than a sister since their parents died young and left Dorothy to raise a child while she was barely out of childhood herself. When they reached the airport terminal, bustling with the controlled chaos of early morning travelers rushing toward their various destinations, Dorothy felt a flutter of nervousness in her chest that had nothing to do with flying and everything to do with the knowledge that she was about to enter a world where people like her weren't usually welcome. Blake Morrison's morning had started at 5 a.m. with a phone call from his divorce attorney, delivering news that felt like a sledgehammer to his already fragile ego. His ex-wife Jennifer had filed an emergency motion to modify their custody agreement, claiming that his recent erratic behavior and financial instability made him unfit for unsupervised visits with their 2 children, and the hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, which meant he had exactly 4 days to somehow convince a judge that he was still the successful executive and devoted father he'd pretended to be for the past 15 years of his marriage. Sitting in his downtown Chicago high-rise apartment that he could barely afford since the separation, surrounded by expensive furniture that now felt like props in a play he could no longer perform, Blake stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw a 48-year-old man whose platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled to hide the growing bald spot, whose custom-tailored suit couldn't disguise the desperate hunger in his pale blue eyes, and whose entire sense of self-worth depended on maintaining the illusion that he was better than everyone around him. Especially people who looked different from him and threatened his precarious position in a world that had started questioning whether men like him deserved the privileges they'd always taken for granted. His tech company, Morrison Digital Solutions, was hemorrhaging money faster than he could find new clients, partly because his abrasive personality had driven away several major accounts over the past year, but mostly because he'd spent more time networking at country clubs and political fundraisers than actually learning how to run a business in an increasingly competitive market. The flight to Los Angeles was supposed to be his last chance to save a crucial contract with a medical technology firm, but his assistant had booked him in economy class as part of the company's new cost-cutting measures, a humiliation that felt like a public announcement of his professional failures and personal inadequacies. Blake had built his entire identity around the belief that success was measured by how much better you were than other people, how much more space you could claim, how many privileges you could accumulate, and how effectively you could use those advantages to keep people beneath you in their proper places. And the thought of sitting in economy class while people who he considered his social inferiors enjoyed the luxury he deserved made his hands clench into fists as he imagined various scenarios where he could reclaim what was rightfully his. He'd noticed during previous flights that older passengers, especially elderly black women, were often traveling on compassionate fares or charity upgrades. People who wouldn't fight back if challenged by someone with authority and confidence. People who had been trained by decades of discrimination to accept whatever space they were allowed without making waves that might disturb the comfortable status quo. As he boarded the plane with his Platinum Elite frequent flyer status, providing him with priority boarding privileges that he wore like armor against his crumbling self-esteem, Blake's eyes immediately locked onto seat 3. Where an elderly black woman sat quietly reading a worn paperback novel, her simple clothing and gentle demeanor marking her as exactly the kind of person he could intimidate into giving up what he wanted, someone whose discomfort would be a small price to pay for his comfort, someone whose dignity was worth less than his need to feel superior in a world that was rapidly leaving him behind. The knitting bag hit the airplane floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the first-class cabin like a gunshot, and Dorothy Washington looked up from her book to see a tall white man with platinum blonde hair standing in the aisle beside her seat. His pale blue eyes filled with the kind of cold contempt that she recognized from her childhood in the segregated South, though she'd hoped never to see it again in her lifetime. Blake Morrison loomed over her with the practiced intimidation tactics of someone who'd spent years using his size and privilege to take what he wanted from people who couldn't fight back his expensive suit and confident posture, designed to project an authority that he believed would make her compliance automatic and unquestioned. There's obviously been some kind of computer error here, and I'm just going to correct it before this becomes a bigger problem for everyone involved, Blake said, his voice carrying the particular kind of politeness that manages to sound more threatening than outright hostility. The tone of someone who believes that reasonable-sounding words can disguise unreasonable actions, that civilized language can mask uncivilized behavior. I fly 200,000 miles a year, Platinum Elite for life, so I understand exactly how these computer glitches happen with last-minute upgrades for people who don't really understand first-class protocols and etiquette. Dorothy felt her heart begin to race as she clutched her boarding pass tighter, the cardstock suddenly feeling fragile between her trembling fingers, while Terrell rose from his seat in 3B, like a protective wall between his grandmother and this stranger who had just thrown her personal belongings on the floor. like garbage. "Excuse me, sir, but that's my grandmother's seat, and she has a valid ticket that I purchased 3 weeks ago," Terrell said, his young voice shaking with controlled anger and bewilderment at finding himself in a situation that felt like stepping back in time to an era he'd only read about in history books. Blake's smile never wavered as he turned his attention to Terrell with the kind of condescending amusement that adults reserve for children who don't understand how the real world works, his head tilting slightly as he looked the teenager up and down with calculated dismissal. "Son, I appreciate that you're trying to help your grandmother, but this is obviously a situation where someone made a mistake with the booking system, probably one of those discount travel websites that oversell seats to people who don't fly regularly." He continued his voice, maintaining that same reasonable tone, while his eyes communicated something entirely different. "The best thing for everyone, especially your grandmother, would be to just accept the seats that are appropriate for your ticket class and let the adults handle the administrative details." Jennifer Hayes, the senior flight attendant who had been with the airline for 12 years and had seen every possible variation of passenger conflict, approached their row with the kind of professional smile that could diffuse most situations before they escalated beyond polite conversation. "Is there something I can help you folks with this morning?" she asked, her trained eye immediately taking in the body language and tension that told her this was going to be more complicated than a simple seating mix-up, though she had no idea that she was about to witness something that would force her to choose between company policies and basic human decency. "Just a simple computer error that needs to be corrected," Blake replied smoothly, pulling out his phone to show what appeared to be a confirmation email, though Jennifer noticed that he held it at an angle that made it difficult for anyone else to read the details clearly. "My seat assignment seems to have been switched with this lady's probably some kind of system glitch when they processed the last-minute changes, and I just want to get everyone seated properly so we can depart on time without any unnecessary delays or complications." Dorothy finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended, carrying decades of conditioning that told her to be polite and accommodating even when faced with obvious injustice. "Young man, I believe there's been some kind of misunderstanding here," she said, holding up her boarding pass with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline and disbelief. "This seat was purchased for me as a birthday gift for my grandson, and I have all the documentation right here in my purse if you'd like to see it, though. I'm not sure why there would be any confusion about legitimate tickets." Blake's reasonable facade began to crack as he realized that Dorothy wasn't going to be as easy to intimidate as he'd assumed her quiet dignity and polite resistance, challenging his expectation that she would immediately defer to his authority and accept whatever alternative he offered. "Ma'am, I understand that you might be confused about how airline seating works, but I've been flying first class on this route for over 15 years, and I can assure you that there are protocols and systems in place to prevent exactly these kinds of misunderstandings," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge as other passengers began to notice the commotion and turn their attention toward the unfolding drama. Captain James Rodriguez had been piloting commercial aircraft for 23 years, long enough to develop an instinct for when passenger conflicts were going to escalate beyond the flight crew's ability to manage them diplomatically. And the radio call from Jennifer requesting his immediate presence in first class carried the kind of urgency that told him this was going to be one of those situations that ended up in incident reports and possibly news headlines. As he made his way through the cabin toward row 3, he could see passengers throughout the plane craning their necks to get a better view of whatever was happening, phones appearing in hands with the automatic reflexes of people who had been trained by social media to document every moment of drama for potential viral content. "Good morning, folks. I'm Captain Rodriguez," he said as he approached the cluster of people gathered around Dorothy's seat, his calm voice and authoritative presence usually enough to de-escalate most conflicts before they required more dramatic interventions. "I understand there might be some confusion about seat assignments, so let's take a look at everyone's boarding passes and get this sorted out quickly and fairly so we can get you all safely to Los Angeles on schedule." Blake immediately stepped forward with the aggressive confidence of someone who believes that taking charge of a situation automatically makes him right, pulling out his boarding pass with a flourish that was designed to demonstrate his cooperativeness and reasonableness to everyone watching. "Captain, I appreciate you taking the time to handle this personally, and I think you'll find that my documentation clearly shows Seat 3A, he said, handing over the boarding pass while maintaining eye contact with an intensity that suggested he was used to having authority figures automatically side with him in disputes with people he considered beneath his social status. Captain Rodriguez examined Blake's boarding pass with the methodical attention of someone who had learned not to make assumptions about passenger disputes, his eyes moving carefully over the printed information while the cabin fell silent except for the ambient noise of the aircraft's ventilation system and the distant sounds of ground crews preparing for departure. After a long moment that felt like an eternity to everyone watching, he looked up with the kind of neutral expression that professional diplomats use when delivering news that someone isn't going to like. "Sir, your boarding pass clearly indicates Seat 12F in the main cabin, not Seat 3A in first class," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice maintaining perfect professional neutrality, while Blake's face began to flush with a combination of embarrassment and growing anger at having his deception exposed in front of an audience. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass as well, just to complete our verification process?" Dorothy handed over her boarding pass with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with people who questioned her right to occupy spaces they thought belonged exclusively to them. Though her hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline of finding herself at the center of a confrontation that felt both surreal and depressingly familiar, Captain Rodriguez examined her documentation with the same careful attention he'd given Blake's, though his expression softened slightly as he confirmed what everyone already knew. Dorothy Washington was legitimately assigned to Seat 3A, purchased and paid for with no irregularities or system errors. "Mrs. Washington, your boarding pass is completely valid and properly issued." For Seat 3, Captain Rodriguez announced to the cabin, his words carrying the weight of official confirmation that should have ended the dispute immediately. But Blake's response suggested that facts were less important to him than maintaining his perceived superiority in front of an audience that was rapidly turning against him. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to take your assigned seat in 12F so we can complete our departure preparations." Blake's carefully constructed facade of reasonableness finally cracked completely as the reality of his public humiliation began to sink in, his voice rising to a level that carried clearly throughout the first-class cabin and into the main passenger compartment beyond. "This is absolutely ridiculous, and I want to speak to someone from customer relations immediately because there's obviously been a massive system failure here," he said, his words tumbling over each other in his desperation to regain control of a narrative that was slipping away from him with every passing second. "I've been a Platinum Elite member of this airline for over 15 years, and I've never been treated with such disrespect and incompetence, especially over some kind of charity case upgrade that probably violates your own policies about passenger qualifications for first-class service." The word charity hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Dorothy felt something inside her chest tighten as she recognized the particular kind of cruelty that uses polite language to deliver messages designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. Terrell started to rise from his seat again, his teenage sense of justice burning bright in his eyes, but Dorothy placed a gentle hand on his arm and shook her head slightly, understanding that this moment required her to draw on reserves of strength that had been built up over decades of facing people who questioned her worth and dignity. Jennifer Hayes, meanwhile, had been discreetly checking her tablet for Blake Morrison's passenger history, and what she found there made her stomach clench with professional disgust and personal anger. 3 formal complaints filed against him over the past 2 years for inappropriate comments toward minority passengers, all of which had been settled quietly by the airline's legal department with non-disclosure agreements and vouchers for future travel, creating a pattern of behavior that had been enabled rather than addressed by corporate policies that prioritized avoiding publicity over protecting passengers from harassment. Dorothy Washington reached into her worn leather purse with movements that seemed impossibly calm given the chaos swirling around her, her fingers finding her cell phone with the automatic precision of someone who had spent decades responding to emergencies with quiet efficiency rather than dramatic gestures. The phone call she was about to make would change everything about this confrontation, though none of the passengers watching her would understand the full significance of her actions until much later when the consequences began rippling through corporate boardrooms and legal offices across multiple industries. Patricia, sweetheart. It's Dorothy, she said into the phone, her voice carrying the warm affection reserved for someone who had been more like a daughter than a former colleague during their 15 years working together at Detroit Medical Center. I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday morning, but I'm having a rather unusual problem here on my flight to Los Angeles, and I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to make some phone calls on my behalf. Dr. Patricia Chen Williams, current chief medical officer for the largest hospital network in the Midwest, had been reviewing surgical schedules in her home office when Dorothy's call came through, but she immediately pushed aside her paperwork because Dorothy Washington had been her mentor, her advocate, and the person who had taught her that healing people required more than medical knowledge. It required understanding how to fight for patients who couldn't fight for themselves. Dorothy, what's happening? Are you okay? Patricia asked, her voice sharpening with concern as she heard the background noise of an airplane cabin and sensed the tension in Dorothy's usually steady tone. Well, there's a gentleman here who seems to believe that people like me don't belong in first-class seating, and he's making quite a scene about it. Dorothy said, her words carefully chosen to convey the situation's seriousness without revealing the full extent of her distress to the audience of passengers who were hanging on every word of this unexpected phone conversation. He works for some kind of technology company, and I thought you might know someone who could help explain to him why treating healthcare workers with respect might be important for his business relationships. Patricia's response was immediate and fierce, though her voice remained professionally controlled as she began to understand exactly what Dorothy was dealing with and how she could help resolve the situation with the kind of institutional power that Blake Morrison would understand far better than appeals to basic human decency. Dorothy, I want you to put me on speakerphone right now, and I want to speak directly to this gentleman who thinks he can intimidate one of the most respected nurses in our state. She said, her words carrying the authority of someone who controlled millions of dollars in medical contracts and could make career-defining decisions with a single phone call. Blake, who had been continuing his increasingly desperate rant about system errors and customer service failures, suddenly found himself facing something he hadn't anticipated. The quiet, dignified elderly woman he'd been trying to intimidate was connected to people with real power, the kind of institutional influence that could affect his company's bottom line and his personal future in ways that his platinum elite frequent flyer status couldn't protect him from. The speakerphone crackled to life with Patricia's voice clear and authoritative enough to cut through his complaints and focus everyone's attention on what was about to happen next. Mr. Morrison, I presume, Patricia said, having quickly looked up his company information while Dorothy was explaining the situation. I'm Dr. Patricia Chen Williams, Chief Medical Officer for Midwest Healthcare Network, and I believe your company, Morrison Digital Solutions, has been pursuing some consulting contracts with our medical technology partners. Is that correct? Blake's face went pale as he realized that his public tantrum was now being witnessed by someone who could single-handedly destroy his company's prospects in the healthcare industry. His mind racing to calculate how much revenue his firm stood to lose if their medical sector contracts disappeared overnight. Dr. Chen Williams, I think there might be some misunderstanding here about what's happening, he started to say. But Patricia cut him off with the kind of surgical precision that she usually reserved for dealing with incompetent administrators who put profits ahead of patient care. Oh, I understand perfectly what's happening, Mr. Morrison. Patricia continued, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who held all the cards in a high-stakes game that Blake was just beginning to realize he was playing. You're attempting to intimidate Dorothy Washington, one of the most beloved and respected healthcare professionals in our region. Someone who trained half the nursing staff currently working in our hospitals, someone whose recommendation has influenced hiring decisions for hundreds of medical professionals over the past 4 decades. The cabin fell completely silent as passengers absorbed the implications of what they were hearing. Phones held steady to capture every word of a confrontation that was rapidly shifting from a simple seating dispute to something much larger and more significant. Dorothy sat quietly in her seat, her expression unchanged, but Terrell looked at his grandmother with newfound understanding of why so many people had spoken at her retirement party about how she had changed their lives and their careers through her mentorship and advocacy. Blake Morrison's phone began buzzing with incoming calls and text messages that he tried to ignore, but the persistent vibration against his chest pocket felt like a countdown timer attached to his professional and personal destruction, each notification representing another crack in the carefully constructed facade that had allowed him to maintain his lifestyle and his illusions for the past several years. The first call was from his business partner, David Chen, whose panicked voice could be heard even though Blake had declined to answer the voicemail notification appearing on his screen, along with a text message that read simply, "Answer your damn phone, now." Medical contracts in jeopardy. Jennifer Hayes, meanwhile, had escalated the situation to ground control and airline management. Her radio conversations with operations creating a paper trail that would protect her from any potential retaliation, while ensuring that corporate executives were aware they had a public relations disaster unfolding in real time on one of their aircraft. The airline's social media monitoring team had already detected the spike in posts tagged with their company name video clips of Blake's confrontation with Dorothy spreading across multiple platforms faster than their crisis management protocols could contain them. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," James Rodriguez announced over the intercom, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would affect everyone on board the aircraft. Due to an ongoing passenger situation that requires documentation and resolution, we're going to be holding our position here at the gate while we work with airport security and company representatives to ensure everyone's safety and comfort. We apologize for any inconvenience and will update you as soon as we have more information. The collective groan from passengers throughout the cabin was audible, though most of the first-class travelers had been watching the confrontation with enough fascination that they understood why departure had been delayed, and several of them had already begun posting their own commentary and video footage on social media platforms with hashtags like #Seatgate and #FirstClassRacism that would soon be trending nationally. Blake felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure, his chest tightening with the realization that his attempt to claim a seat he didn't deserve had instead claimed his career, his custody rights, and possibly his entire future. Dorothy's phone rang again this time with a call from Judge Patricia Washington, no relation despite sharing a name, who served on the hospital network's board of directors and had heard about the situation through the medical community's remarkably efficient communication network. "Dorothy, honey, I just got off the phone with Patricia Chen Williams, and I want you to know that the entire medical community is rallying behind you," Judge Washington said, her voice warm with the kind of support that comes from decades of professional relationships built on mutual respect and shared values. "I've already made calls to 3 major medical technology firms that do business with Morrison's company, and they're all reconsidering their relationships with any vendor whose employees demonstrate this kind of behavior toward healthcare workers." Blake overheard enough of this conversation to understand that his problems were multiplying exponentially, that Dorothy Washington wasn't just a retired nurse with influential friends, but someone whose career had created a network of professional relationships that spanned the entire healthcare industry in multiple states. People who owed their success partly to her mentorship and guidance, people who were now using their considerable influence to defend her against his attack on her dignity. His ex-wife's attorney had already called twice, leaving messages about how video footage of his behavior would be submitted as evidence in their custody hearing, proof that he was unfit to have unsupervised visits with children who needed to learn respect and tolerance, rather than witnessing their father's racism and entitlement. The airline's customer service manager, Robert Kim, appeared in the first-class cabin with the kind of grim expression that suggested he'd already reviewed the video footage and witness statements that would be included in the incident report, his presence signaling that this situation had escalated far beyond anything the flight crew could handle internally. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need you to come with me so we can discuss this situation privately and determine the best way to proceed," he said, his tone professional but firm in a way that made it clear this wasn't a request but a directive backed by federal aviation regulations about disruptive passengers. Blake looked around the cabin one final time, seeing his reflection in the recording screens of dozens of phones, understanding that this moment would follow him forever, that his name would be permanently associated with the kind of racist behavior that decent people found reprehensible, that his children would someday see this footage and have to reconcile it with whatever positive memories they might have of their father. Dorothy Washington met his eyes with an expression that contained no satisfaction or vindication, just the kind of sad understanding that comes from a lifetime of witnessing people destroy themselves through hatred and fear of others who looked different from them. Blake Morrison's carefully constructed world collapsed with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition, each phone call and notification arriving like precisely placed charges, designed to bring down the entire structure of his professional and personal life with maximum efficiency and minimum chance for recovery. His business partner David had finally reached him despite his attempts to avoid the conversation, his voice crackling through the phone with barely controlled panic as he explained that Midwest Healthcare Network had just suspended all pending contracts, pending a review of vendor personnel practices and public behavior standards, a corporate euphemism that translated to millions of dollars in lost revenue and the effective death of Morrison Digital Solutions as a viable business entity. "Blake, what the hell did you do?" David's voice carried the particular kind of fury reserved for business partnerships destroyed by one person's stupidity, his words echoing through the first-class cabin as other passengers leaned in to hear both sides of a conversation that was rapidly becoming public entertainment. "I've got Patricia Chen Williams' office on line 2 telling me that our medical consulting contracts are being terminated immediately. I've got 3 other healthcare networks calling to cancel meetings we've been setting up for months. And I've got our insurance company asking questions about liability coverage for employee actions that might constitute discrimination or harassment." Blake tried to formulate a response that might salvage something from the wreckage, but his throat felt constricted with the kind of panic that makes coherent speech impossible. His hands shaking as he attempted to hold the phone steady while processing the magnitude of what he had done to himself and everyone who depended on his company for their livelihoods. "David, listen. There's been a misunderstanding here, some kind of mix-up with seat assignments that got blown out of proportion," he managed to say, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded desperate and pathetic. The kind of excuse that only made the situation worse by demonstrating his refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. Jennifer Hayes had positioned herself strategically near Blake's location with the practiced efficiency of a flight attendant who had dealt with hundreds of disruptive passengers over her career, though she had never seen someone self-destruct quite so thoroughly in such a short period of time, his visible desperation and mounting panic creating the kind of scene that would require incident reports, security involvement, and possibly federal charges, depending on how much further he was willing to escalate the situation. Airport security officers were already boarding the aircraft through the forward door, their presence adding an official gravity to what had started as a simple seating dispute, but had evolved into something much more serious and potentially criminal. Blake's ex-wife, Jennifer, the irony of sharing a name with the flight attendant who was documenting his behavior wasn't lost on anyone paying attention, had left a voicemail that played automatically when he accidentally hit the wrong button while trying to decline another call. Her voice filled with disgust and determination as she explained how his public racist tantrum would be presented as evidence in their custody hearing scheduled for Monday morning. "Blake, I just saw the video that's all over social media. and I want you to know that my attorney is filing an emergency motion to suspend your visitation rights immediately, because I will not have my children exposed to the kind of hatred and entitlement you displayed on that airplane," her recorded voice announced to the entire first-class cabin, each word landing like a physical blow against his already shattered composure. The children, she was referring to 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler, were the only genuinely good things Blake had ever created in his life, and the thought of losing them permanently because of his inability to control his racism and entitlement sent him into a full emotional breakdown that played out in front of dozens of witnesses with their cameras rolling, capturing every moment of his transformation from arrogant aggressor to desperate sobbing wreckage of a human being. His expensive suit, which had been designed to project authority and success, now looked like a costume worn by someone playing a role he could no longer maintain, the fabric wrinkled and stained with sweat, as he finally confronted the reality of who he had become and what he had lost. Dorothy Washington watched this disintegration with the kind of professional detachment that comes from decades of witnessing people at their lowest moments. Though her expression carried the particular sadness of someone who understood that Blake's racism had ultimately hurt him as much as it had hurt her, that his desperate need to feel superior to others had trapped him in a prison of hatred that was now destroying everything he claimed to value. Terrell, sitting beside his grandmother, felt a mixture of anger and pity as he watched a grown man cry like a child who had just realized that actions have consequences, that the world doesn't always bend to accommodate people who believe they deserve special treatment because of their race or social status. The airline customer service manager had returned with 2 airport police officers, whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the cabin from dramatic entertainment to serious legal proceedings, their uniforms and equipment serving as visual reminders that Blake's behavior had crossed the line from inappropriate to potentially criminal, depending on how thoroughly they chose to investigate his actions and their impact on other passengers. "Mr. Morrison, you're going to need to come with us now so we can complete our investigation and determine what charges, if any, will be filed in connection with this incident," Officer Sarah Martinez said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who dealt with airport disruptions as routine parts of her job, though the video evidence and witness statements in this case made it clear that this wasn't a typical passenger dispute. Blake Morrison stood in the airplane aisle surrounded by uniformed officers and airline personnel, his face streaked with tears and his breathing shallow with panic, when Dorothy Washington did something that no one in the cabin expected. She asked the officers to wait a moment so she could speak to him directly, person to person, without the audience of cameras and official procedures that had turned their confrontation into public theater. The request surprised everyone, including Blake himself, who had spent the past hour experiencing Dorothy as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a human being deserving of basic respect and dignity. "Mr. Morrison." Dorothy said, her voice gentle but clear enough for everyone in first class to hear before the officers take you away. "I want you to understand something about who you tried to humiliate today, not because I need to prove anything to you, but because you need to understand the full scope of what you've done to yourself and your family through your actions." She paused, letting the words settle in the cabin like sediment in still water, giving Blake a moment to process what she was offering him: truth instead of punishment, understanding instead of revenge, education instead of simple consequences. Blake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. His breathing still irregular, but his attention focused completely on Dorothy for the first time since he'd approached her seat, seeing her not as a symbol of what he feared or resented, but as an actual person whose life and experiences had value independent of his opinions about where she belonged or what she deserved. 15 years ago, your son Tyler was born 3 months premature at Detroit Medical Center, and I was the head nurse in the neonatal intensive care unit, who spent 17 days and nights monitoring his breathing, adjusting his feeding tubes, and coordinating with the medical team that saved his life. Dorothy continued, her words hitting Blake like physical blows as he realized she was talking about his son, his beautiful boy who was now 6 years old and healthy because of medical intervention that this woman had provided. The cabin fell completely silent as passengers absorbed the devastating irony of what Dorothy was revealing. Blake had spent the morning trying to humiliate and displace the very person whose professional expertise and dedication had ensured his child's survival during the most critical period of his young life. Blake's legs seemed to give out slightly as the full weight of this revelation settled over him, his hand reaching for the nearest seat back to steady himself as he processed the magnitude of his moral failure and the cosmic justice of finding himself face to face with someone who had saved what he claimed to love most in the world. "I remember you, actually." Dorothy continued, her voice still gentle, despite the power of her words to completely destroy Blake's remaining sense of self-righteousness. "You spent most of those 17 days in the NICU family waiting room, pacing back and forth and making phone calls to your insurance company about coverage limits, worried about the financial cost of your son's care, and I remember thinking that you were just a frightened father who needed someone to tell him that everything was going to be okay." The memory she was sharing painted a picture of Blake at his most vulnerable and human, a stark contrast to the entitled aggressor he had become during their confrontation, showing everyone in the cabin that people were capable of both tremendous love and terrible cruelty, sometimes within the same person. Blake's voice, when he finally found it, came out as barely more than a whisper, cracked with emotion and disbelief at the connection Dorothy had just revealed. You were there when Tyler was born. You took care of him." He asked his question carrying the weight of a father's gratitude mixed with the shame of someone who had just realized he had attacked his child's savior, creating a moment of recognition that cut through all the rhetoric and posturing to reveal the essential humanity that connected them despite their differences in race, age, and social position. "I held your son when he was too small to survive without machines. I monitored his vital signs when every breath was a struggle. And I was there the morning when he finally reached 5 pounds, and the doctors said he was strong enough to go home to his family." Dorothy replied, her words creating a bridge of shared experience that made Blake's racist assumptions impossible to maintain. "And now, 15 years later, you're willing to destroy your relationship with that same child by demonstrating the kind of hatred and intolerance that no parent should ever model for their children, teaching him that some people matter less than others based on the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth." The officers waited patiently while this extraordinary conversation unfolded, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and valuable, a moment of genuine human connection emerging from conflict. The kind of teaching moment that had the potential to transform both participants if they were brave enough to embrace its lessons, rather than retreating into defensiveness and denial. Blake Morrison stood at a crossroads between the person he had been and the person he could choose to become, with dozens of witnesses and recording devices capturing whatever decision he made about how to respond to Dorothy's grace and truth-telling. Blake Morrison's transformation began with the kind of deep, shuddering breath that signals the moment when a person stops running from the truth and finally allows themselves to see clearly. His shoulders slumping as the defensive posture that had sustained him through years of professional and personal failures finally collapsed under the weight of Dorothy Washington's revelation about their connection through his son's life. The cabin remained completely silent as he processed the magnitude of what she had told him, his mind racing through memories of those terrifying days when Tyler's survival had hung in the balance, remembering the gentle voice of a black nurse who had spoken to him with kindness during the darkest period of his life as a father. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice breaking with emotion that was raw and genuine for the first time since he'd boarded the aircraft. "I don't know how to apologize for what I've done, for how I've acted, for the person I've become since those days when you were saving my son's life, and I was too scared and selfish to appreciate the gift you were giving our family." The words came slowly at first, each one seeming to cause him physical pain as he forced himself to acknowledge truths he had spent years avoiding through anger and blame, and desperate attempts to feel superior to people who were actually better than him in every way that mattered. Dorothy listened with the same professional compassion she had brought to decades of nursing, understanding that Blake's breakdown was the necessary prelude to any genuine change in his character, that people had to completely fall apart before they could rebuild themselves into something healthier and more whole. "Mr. Morrison, I can see that you're in pain, and I believe that pain is partly what drove you to act so cruelly today," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen people at their worst and their best, often within the same person at different moments in their lives. But pain is not an excuse for hatred, and fear of losing what you have is not a reason to try to take what belongs to someone else. Blake nodded through his tears, finally understanding that Dorothy was offering him something more valuable than the first-class seat he had tried to steal. She was offering him a path toward redemption that would require him to do the hard work of examining his prejudices and changing his behavior, not just apologizing for this one incident, but committing to becoming the kind of person who deserved the love of children like Tyler and Emma. "I want to make this right," he said, though his voice carried uncertainty about what that might mean or whether it was even possible after everything that had happened. "I don't know how, but I want to try to make this right, not just for you, but for my children who deserve better than what I've been showing them." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward with the authority of someone who had dealt with hundreds of passenger conflicts over his career, though he had never seen one resolve in quite this way, with genuine accountability and the promise of personal growth emerging from what had started as simple racist entitlement. "Mr. Morrison, the officers still need to complete their investigation, and there will be consequences for your behavior that are beyond anyone's control at this point," he said, his tone remaining professional while acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had led to this moment of potential transformation. "But I want you to know that Mrs. Washington's willingness to speak with you directly shows the kind of grace that this situation needed, and I hope you'll honor that grace by following through on your commitment to change." Blake turned to face the entire first-class cabin, looking directly at the passengers who had witnessed his racist tantrum and subsequent breakdown. His face flushed with shame, but his voice steady with newfound resolve as he prepared to make a public acknowledgement that would be recorded and shared across social media platforms for years to come. "I want everyone here to know that what you witnessed today was not Mrs. Washington's fault, and it wasn't caused by any computer error or seating confusion," he said, his words carrying the weight of complete honesty for the first time in the entire confrontation. "What you witnessed was my racism, my entitlement, and my belief that I deserved something more than this remarkable woman who saved my son's life 15 years ago, and I am deeply ashamed of the person I showed you today." The apology hung in the air for a moment before spontaneous applause began from several passengers, not celebrating Blake's words, but acknowledging Dorothy's grace in creating space for accountability and growth rather than simply demanding punishment and revenge. Terrell reached over to squeeze his grandmother's hand, understanding that he had just witnessed a master class in how to respond to hatred with wisdom, how to transform conflict into opportunity for healing, and how to maintain dignity even when facing people who tried to strip it away through cruelty and intimidation. Jennifer Hayes, who had been documenting the entire incident for her incident report, felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, genuine human connection emerging from racial conflict. The kind of breakthrough that textbooks and training seminars tried to create but rarely achieved, because it required the kind of moral courage that Dorothy had displayed throughout this impossible situation. The officers who had come to arrest Blake found themselves in the unusual position of witnessing genuine accountability and remorse, though they still had procedures to follow and reports to file that would ensure appropriate consequences for his initial behavior. 6 months after the incident that became known across social media as #FirstClass, Grace, Dorothy Washington sat in the same first-class seat on the same route to Los Angeles, though this time she was traveling not to say goodbye to a dying sister, but to speak at a national nursing conference about dignity, professional ethics, and the power of responding to hatred with wisdom rather than revenge. The flight attendant who greeted her was Jennifer Hayes, who had requested to work this particular route because she wanted to personally ensure that Dorothy's travel experience reflected the respect and courtesy that should have been extended to her from the beginning. "Mrs. Washington, it's an honor to have you flying with us again," Jennifer said, her voice carrying genuine warmth and admiration for a woman who had transformed a moment of racial harassment into a teaching opportunity that had inspired thousands of people across the country to examine their own prejudices and commit to treating others with greater respect and understanding. The other first-class passengers, many of whom recognized Dorothy from news coverage of the original incident, smiled and nodded their acknowledgement of her presence, creating an atmosphere of welcome that stood in stark contrast to the hostility she had faced during her previous flight. Blake Morrison, meanwhile, was beginning his third month as a volunteer coordinator at a non-profit organization that provided support services to families with children in neonatal intensive care units, his former company having dissolved completely after the loss of medical sector contracts, but his new work providing him with a sense of purpose and meaning that his previous career had never offered. He had written to Dorothy several times during his 6 months of therapy and community service, sharing his progress in understanding how his racism had developed and his commitment to raising his children with the values of respect and equality that she had demonstrated during their confrontation. The custody arrangement with his ex-wife had stabilized after Blake completed an intensive program on cultural sensitivity and parenting without prejudice, his children slowly beginning to rebuild their relationship with a father who was learning to model the kind of behavior he wanted them to emulate, rather than the entitled racism that had nearly destroyed their family. Tyler, now 7 years old and thriving, had no memory of Dorothy Washington's role in saving his life as a premature infant. But Blake had begun sharing that story with both his children as a way of teaching them about the debt of gratitude they owed to people whose service and sacrifice often went unrecognized and unappreciated. Dorothy's sister Patricia had made a remarkable recovery from her cancer diagnosis, the family rallying around her with the kind of coordinated medical care that Dorothy's professional network had been able to facilitate, creating a support system that had transformed a terminal prognosis into a survivable treatment plan. Terrell, now 18 and starting his freshman year at Howard University on a pre-med track, carried with him the memory of watching his grandmother respond to hatred with grace, understanding that her example had provided him with a template for how to navigate a world that would challenge his dignity and humanity in ways that previous generations had hoped to spare their children from experiencing. The nursing conference where Dorothy was scheduled to speak had sold out within hours of her name being added to the program, with healthcare workers from across the country traveling to hear her discuss not just the airplane incident, but the broader principles of maintaining professional compassion and personal dignity in environments where both were often under assault from people who mistook cruelty for strength and prejudice for authority. Her presentation would focus on the idea that healthcare workers had both the opportunity and the responsibility to model the kind of human connection that could heal not just physical ailments, but the social divisions that created illness and suffering in communities across the nation. As the plane reached cruising altitude and Dorothy opened the book she had brought for the flight, a memoir by another nurse who had spent her career advocating for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from a moment of public humiliation to a platform for national conversation about race dignity and the possibility of genuine human transformation. The seat that Blake Morrison had tried to steal from her had become a symbol of something much larger than airline seating policies. It represented the ongoing struggle for Black Americans to occupy space they had earned and deserved to claim dignity, that others tried to deny them, and to respond to hatred with the kind of grace that could transform enemies into allies and conflicts into opportunities for growth and understanding. The flight landed smoothly at LAX, and as Dorothy gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, she carried with her not just the memory of Blake Morrison's attempted intimidation, but also the knowledge that her response to his hatred had created ripple effects of positive change that would continue long after their confrontation had faded, from social media trends and news cycles proving once again that the most powerful response to darkness was not to fight it with equal darkness, but to shine light so bright that shadows could no longer survive in its presence.